Hello there. On today's video, we're going to discuss module attributes. And what are they? Well, just like the name implies, it's an attribute of a module. And they are going to be used in two scenarios mostly. The first one is a compile time constant that lives inside your module. And the other one is to create documentation for your module and the functions inside your module. Okay, so how do I create a module attribute? Inside your module, you're gonna type the @ symbol, and then you're gonna write what's the name of your module attribute. So here I'm gonna say whatever, and then this is followed by the value of the module attribute. So here I'm creating this attribute called whatever, and the value of it is a string called whatever. And throughout the code, I can use this function, constant however I like. So for example, here on the trim text function, instead of returning this, now I'm returning this module attribute. And one very important thing to notice here is that if you're doing any operation to generate a module attribute, this is going to be calculated during compile time and not runtime, okay? So for example, if I create a constant here called time now, and I call this function UTC now from the datetime module, what's going to happen is I'm going to run mix compile or mix release to release my to create a binary for my Phoenix application. Then I'm gonna run this function during compile time, save this on a constant, and then every time I call time now, I'm gonna get the same old result. Okay, so this is a compile time constant. Okay, so where am I gonna use these constants on Elixir? Well, I'm gonna use TechSchool as an example. So here I have a module that I created to interact with the GitHub API. I think the code looks very clean if I create one constant to save the GitHub API URL. So I created a module attribute called base URL, and it's this string right here. Okay, so every time I need to call the GitHub API, I'm just gonna use the base URL constant. Okay, one other example that I have is to make my life easier, because there is translation on TechSchool. I'm displaying the text in English and Brazilian Portuguese. So I have a module called locale, and every time I have to interact with the locale, I call this module. And inside this module, I have two constants, one called default locale and another one called available locales. Okay, I need to get the available locales and get the default locales many times throughout the application on TechSchool. So this is a very common operation. And instead of calling application.compilenv get text default locale every time I need the default locale, what I'm doing is I'm calling this function one time only. I'm storing it on a module attribute called default locale, and then I am returning this constant if you call this function right here. So if outside this module you call TechSchool .locale .get available locales, there you go. You get the available locales without having to call this annoying function every time. Okay, so in my opinion, this makes the code more organized. And be aware that this is calculated during compile time. So I'm calling this function here at compile time. If anything changes on my environment variables, for example, this is not going to change my default locale constant. because it was generated a while ago when I compiled, and it's the same. Unless I compile again, I'm going to reuse the same value, okay? So what else can I use module attributes? As I said in the beginning of the video, we can use it to document your module and your module functions. So if you go back to the code that was generated initially with mix new, we have a tutorial module. We have the @ symbol here, right, to create a module attribute. And if you use the special word moduledoc, you're going to create a documentation for the module. And if you use the special word doc, you're going to create documentation specific to the function, okay? So let's create some documentation for helpers.format. First, let's create for the module. So I'm gonna write @moduledoc, okay? And if you want to do a multi-line documentation, you can use this triple double strings here, okay? And then whatever you type here is gonna be your documentation for the module. So here I'm just gonna let Copilot write for me. Okay, documentation for helpers format, nice. Now let's write documentation for the function. Again, we're gonna type @doc and then the triple double quotes, sorry. Okay, this function is gonna trim the text, fair enough. And then let's close the documentation. Whoops, get out of here. Okay. Now, one thing that is important to note about documentation is that if I hover the mouse on top of this function, it's gonna show the documentation. So here you can see documentation, trim text. And whatever I write here is gonna show up, okay? So if I hover the text again on top of trim text, you can see trim text dot whatever I write here is gonna show up. And the same goes for the module documentation. If I write something crazy like this and I hover the mouse on top, there you go. Documentation for helpers.format, documentation for helpers.format. I can even, for testing purposes, write the lorem ipsum. And if I hover the mouse, there you go, lorem ipsum. So this is very nice for VS Code integration because other developers can just hover the mouse on top of your code and they can see what it does. And not only that, but let me just recompile my code. If I call that very useful function h on the terminal, h helpers.format, I get the documentation. Lorem ipsum dolo si blah, blah, blah. Okay, nice. And if I call the same h function to the helpers.format.trim text, again, we can read the documentation here. Trim text, whatever I read here is gonna show up. This is very interesting. And you can do some basic like Markdown formatting inside this documentation. So I'm gonna bring the text school once again. Let me see if I have any nice example of this. I'm gonna go to my backend code. I'm gonna go to courses. Oh, not this one. I want the context. The courses context. Here, I have a function called create course, right? If I hover the mouse here, you can read the documentation, and not only that, but check this out. I have examples of how to use this code. And how do I do that? Well, check the doc of the create course. Here we have a text to describe what this function is all about. And then we have some markdown formatting, like I have the double hashtag here as like a subtitle or title of examples. And here I wrote IEX and an arrow to simulate running this function on the terminal, right? And if I try to run TechSchool locally on IEX, just to show you guys that this documentation works, I can type h and then techschool.courses. I want the documentation for create course. Okay, check this out. We have some formatting on the terminal as well. Creates a course and associates it with the channel, and we have examples with code. You see? Now, this looks very cool in my opinion. Super nice, right? And you don't need to install any package for that. It's built in the language. Documentation for modules and functions, they are a first-class citizen in Elixir, and this is so cool. And that's pretty much it. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.